My name is Masha, and I'm the Director of Global Mobility and Corporate Services here at Deel. I've been in mobility for about 15, 20 years. It's scary how quickly that goes. And why am I so passionate about it? I am a serial expat myself. I've lived in 8 countries in the last 5 years. I've led lots of different hard projects that were mobility related. I've gotten people out of jail at the border. And every single time there's something new. It's hard. It's something that is not an exact science. And I think it really tickles my brain, honestly. And so I keep feeling like there's more to learn and there's more to discover. So for me, mobility is really my lifelong passion. Roland.
Thank you. Nice to meet you, everybody. So my name's Roland Rosevear, and I'm a senior enterprise account executive here at Deel. So I'm lucky enough to be able to work with lots of Deel's largest and most strategic customers to help them solve a lot of their challenges. I've been in the talent industry for 20 plus years, but for the last 5 years, I've really focused on the HR tech world with a particular specialization in kind of global talent solutions. As an individual, I'm very passionate about mobility myself. Similar to Marsha, mobility has been a big part of my life. I moved to Dubai and worked there for a couple of years and relocated fully, and then moved back to England. And now I've recently relocated with my family over to Spain. And I know the impact those moves have had on my life. And what I love working about Deel and for technology businesses is you can have that kind of impact, but at scale, for literally hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions of people across the world who are all impacted at scale about what mobility can really do to kind of change people's lives.
Amazing.
And that's me. Should we give a quick introduction to perhaps Deel and what Deel is before we dive into the questions?
I think so. Let's do that.
Excellent. If you could just bring up the next slide there. Perfect. So just for a very brief introduction to Deel. So who is Deel? Essentially, we're an HR platform that helps organizations to be able to hire and engage workers anywhere around the world. We're a relatively young business in the grand scheme of things. We were only founded in 2019. And when we first came about as a platform, our big focus was on international hires, but focused purely in the contractor world. So what we foresaw is there was a big trend in terms of companies wanting to be able to hire international talent rather than just people who could commute to their office, and contracting was a great way to do that. So we've created that product, and that really took off, and especially around the time of COVID and a real shift in terms of remote working, our growth just skyrocketed. And what we found with all the customers we acquired looking to hire international contractors, then a lot of those were looking to be able to really hire those on more of a permanent basis. And a lot of our early customers initially were kind of startups and scale ups. Perhaps they didn't already have the infrastructure globally to be able to take on those people. So that's when we launched the idea of around employer of record. And we looked at it as an industry that was already existing, but there was just lots of improvements that could be made to it with better service levels and technology enabling it, really. So in one of our values, which is Deel Speed, we went around as fast as we could and set up entities all around the world. We noticed one of the problems with EOR is there was lots of different suppliers involved and people outsourcing to different people in different countries, but we wanted to own that service all of ourselves. So we set it up, I think we're up to over 100 different entities around the world. We then staffed that
105.
105, it changes daily. We then staffed that with over 3,000 Deel employees. I couldn't give you the exact number for that because that literally changes on a daily basis with our growth. So we've got local experts in Marsha's team with local mobility experts, payroll experts, legal experts, customer success and service experts who can all give you that local service but on a global scale. And as that product really took off, then we moved into the global payroll space. And now we help enterprises and businesses pay their own direct staff. We've now got our own HRIS system and mobility services. And we're just continuing to grow and grow to be that one-stop HR platform, really. And we've moved in that period from starting off to serve small to medium-sized startups to now partnering with lots of large enterprises across the globe, like some of the brands there. So I think that's probably a bit of a good intro into Deel as a whole. Should we dive into some of the questions, Marcia?
Let's do it. Let's do it. You did such a good job. I was wondering what Deel does. Okay, so there are a ton of questions, but we sort of grouped them by themes. So since we're on Deel, maybe we can talk a little bit more about what an employer of record is, because I think most people don't actually know what it is, how it looks, what does it do, and what can you actually do with it. So how can we help our clients who don't have an entity abroad? Can you talk a little bit about that, Roland?
Definitely, yeah. And this is one of Deel's kind of flagship products and what we became really famous doing, really. So the idea behind an employer of record is when an organization wants to hire an individual in a foreign country and they don't want to go through all of the process for setting up their own entity, what they can do is come to a company like Deel, who owns their own entity and has all their own local HR and payroll support in that country. And Deel can actually hire that individual ourselves. We work with you as the client to make sure that they've got the right employment agreement, work out what the right benefits are. There's some flexibility on what benefits they have, but it's our role as Deel to make sure that employee has at least the bare minimum statutory requirements given in that country. And then we'll employ that individual. They'll be onboarded via our platform. We'll be fully responsible for that onboarding process. And then it's our role then to administer kind of their HR rights and benefits and to pay them. But in terms of the working relationship, they're working directly with you. We're not getting involved with them on a day-to-day basis. And we're just making sure that they're compliantly hired.
Caveat that.
Yeah.
Caveat that. Not everywhere. We are
Correct.
actually evolving that model because in some jurisdictions, and this is why this is so interesting, there is quite a larger duty of care that we need to take over the employees. And so we try to make it smooth and seamless. We just acquired a startup that does performance reviews, for example. And so there's lots of different process, like different support structures that we're adding into our model, because I think the EOR model actually is not new. It's been around for like 60 years, but the way that we're now starting to evolve it, that's new, because we really do care for the employees, their well-being, whether or not the relationship is supported in the right way. And it's very custom to the jurisdiction we're talking about.
And that's one of the challenging things with dealing with on a global scale is it's not a static thing. Changes are happening all the time in this space, and quarter by quarter we've got our legal experts reviewing all the rules, and in some countries there might need to be a slight tweak. I think you were mentioning about the Singapore and Germany, and in some cases the UK scenarios where it's the EOR model, but it just needs to have some tweaks to make sure it's got that local compliance, really.
Exactly. Because ultimately what we want is we want to alleviate friction, and we want to make sure that everybody's compliant. And I think it's not just for that one employee that you want to hire abroad, right? Sometimes as a startup, and I've been part of so many startups, you're just not quite sure you're ready to go into that market. So this is your testing, right? You're dipping your toe in the water, trying to figure out, is this somewhere I really want to be? And when you're ready, when you decide that, the Netherlands is actually the hub I want to create in Europe, as I expand globally, you started with EOR, but then we can help you set up an entity. We can help you continue running your payroll, continue to provide all the ecosystem that we have as you sort of expand. So that's the next level of growth.
I think it's quite interesting also that the different use cases that we see coming up for EOR, because a lot of people just think like, right, want to hire someone in a new country. I don't have an entity. That's why I would use them. But especially in the enterprise space, I actually see that the main difference quite a lot. So a big part of it is around retention, actually. And when you've got really key members of staff and they're wanting to move somewhere rather than the business having a need somewhere, and how can we retain that individual and keep that person? I see a lot in the enterprise space at the moment in terms of M&As as well. So when you're acquiring a new business, you're acquiring a business with staff all around the world and you don't have entities in that area, how can you work with those? And those can be really exciting projects because you can have quite high volumes of people coming in quite a short period of time in a window, making sure that all of their benefits match and having a quick solution that you can just plug in straight away. And that might be because it's then a short-term thing and maybe you then do set up some entities later down the line, but it just gives you that kind of flexibility, really.
Yeah, absolutely. Or maybe you're reacting to a conflict that's happening in the world and you really want to move your employees and you need to do it fast and you just don't have time to set something up. So there's lots of different use cases. We gave you kind of the overview, but maybe we can jump in a little bit more into mobility since this is the real topic, yes?
Yeah, exactly. And I think one of the next questions that came up was specifically around the US. So what are the options, Marsha, when bringing in international talent from various countries into the US specifically then?
It's such a difficult question. US is quite restrictive, right? We all know that. And so lots of companies approach it differently. So we offer both sort of the PEO model in the US, but we also offer the standalone specifically for mobility. So if you have an entity in the US already, we could explore your intra-company transfers. We could explore putting a blanket in place. But this is a very hard question to answer because it really depends. And I feel like that's true for almost every mobility question. So whoever asks that, you should come talk to me and we can actually assess your needs. Are you bringing in, I don't know, Singaporeans? We could do an H-1B one, right? Like, or Australians, we can do something more specific to that nationality. Are you bringing people in for a temporary type of stint just to train? You could possibly do a J. So there's a lot of possibilities, but it really depends on the business setup, on the business need, and on the short versus the long-term goals. Because if your long-term goal is to essentially bring people in and have them then apply for the green card and become and naturalize, which is something I did, for example, that's a really long process. And so you need to strategize with them a long time before you ever bring them over, really. Let's see. I think the next one, it asks a very interesting question. Somebody asked, what is global mobility? But I think most people probably know what global mobility is here. I think it also evolves, and it depends on what business structure you have and what your needs are. Global mobility can be your traditional setup of, you have the tax pillar for your expats, you have the relocation pillar, and then you have your immigration pillar. Or it could be something more creative, like, how do I utilize the contractor model around the world? How do I utilize the EOR around the world? Do I want to do remote hybrid type of setup? So mobility is evolving and the structures within it are evolving. And I think lots of people are moving away from traditional assignments to something a little bit more lightweight, but more flexible for their employees.
And out of interest, with mobility having changed so much, especially over the last 10 years or so in terms of what kind of cases mobility professionals are having to deal with these days, what would you say are some of the most challenging changes for people in the mobility industry that they're going to face over the coming years?
I mean, I think for everybody, COVID was kind of in a what is happening moment, right? And everyone went through stages. It's like stages of grief. First, you're like, oh, it's kind of cool to be home. Then, oh, of course I understand that you want to go and be with your family somewhere else. And we're just not going to care. We want to be supportive. But then you start thinking, wait, but there is a compliance issue. Is there a permanent establishment issue? Is there a tax issue? Is there an immigration issue? Then all of a sudden you see again an evolution to maybe a hybrid type of approach. Oh, but you need to only go to these places where we have entities set up, and we will only support a certain set of services, right? And then it kind of evolved into very distinct camps. You have the remote, and then you have like the hybrid or even pushing back to the office. And you can see that in different country legislations as well. My team was the team that set up our 105 entities. And in so many places, when we were getting our licensing around registration or around supporting employees, we were required to have an office. And there were lots of conversations with the government officials where they said, we don't understand the concept of remote. We don't believe in it. And you have to deal with it. And so then there was a lot of education around it, and this evolution that has happened and then kind of went back. It was hard to navigate for most mobility professionals.
And I think, especially looking over that journey, it's that roles change from it being more of a logistics role in some ways about how do we physically move people to the families, exactly, to more HR. And I think there's definitely been, from what I've seen anyway, more close working between HR and mobility as one unit rather than separately. Do you think that the role of a mobility professional is going to encompass more HR in the future?
I think they go together. When mobility professionals are strictly mobility professionals, I think it's kind of a partial view. You absolutely need to understand local labor regulations. You absolutely need to understand statutory benefits, and it will play a role in how you think about deploying or distributing your resources and your people. And so it's evolving. And then you add to it the complexity of politics and economy and the change in legislation around that. And so you see some tightening of legislation. You see, obviously, some really difficult issues around, like, armed conflicts around the world, for example. And as a mobility professional, all of a sudden now you have to react to this, and very rapidly. And so you're no longer even just executing. You have to have a strategy. How do you get your people out? Where are you going to take them? Can you legally take them somewhere else? So there's so many different situations that, honestly, I've seen mobility become a very strategic advisory service, and the more operational piece tends to move a little bit towards the operational side. But they still have to go hand in hand. And it also will depend, obviously, on how large or how small the startup is. When I was at Palantir in the beginning, I was everything. I was the mobility professional. I was the employment lawyer. I was the HR. I was the benefits person. I did it all. As we grew, it changed.
Definitely. Another question here, which I think is a really interesting one, especially when you're sat there in a mobility team. Often you have to deal with so many different partners and providers. When you've had to do that over the years, Marsha, how have you gone about making sure you pick the right partners and trustworthy partners in the mobility space?
I've done lots of essentially business cases, right? And everybody does like an RFP, but that seems very long and sometimes protracted. And when you start, by the time you finish, you forget what it is that you were trying to evaluate. I really like to give my vendors a hard problem that either I've just solved or I am in the process of solving, and really see if they can partner with me and think through that problem with me in real time. That tells you a lot. But then the other piece of it is you just have to have technology now. You have to have technology supporting whatever the service is. You see this a lot with RMCs, right? There are some really amazing companies out there who will move you, and they will move you really well. But when you go on their website, it is really clunky and the software is really difficult to navigate. There's something about this space that just needs disruption from like the technological space. And I think that there were some questions specifically around AI actually at some point, and mobility. But we can talk about it even right now. Even if, when you're looking at the YC Combinator and some of the cool startups that are coming out of that, some of the work that we're doing around AI, there's just so much. If you're thinking about doing an O1 petition, for example, right? I don't know how many people know what an O1 is. It's a US visa for exceptional talent that could be used, for example, for founders. At minimum, you're going to have 500 pages. And most of them are about 1,000-page petitions. And a lot of it is just manual legal drafting. Can you imagine how helpful AI can be in this? How much faster we can produce your petition? Part of the anxiety around mobility is this black hole of, I gave everything to this person and they're doing something, I hope, but I don't know what they're doing. I don't know when they're going to give it to me. I can't look at it. And I'm anxious because I have decided that I'm going to the US, for example, and I'm ready. Here's my business idea. I'm ready to go. And so everything is dependent on this 1,000-page petition. That's scary. That's anxiety producing. AI can really help there with transparency, with speed, with quality. We're all just human. I can't imagine drafting a 1,000-page petition.
No, absolutely. And it's getting that balance of technology and people right, isn't it? Because, for great service, you need great people, but you also need a great quality and standard of automated processes, because in any organization, all people are different. And when you're purely relying on an individual delivering a service, it's never going to be consistent when that's scaled up globally. But if you can have that right balance of technology, automated processes, AI, and real people to help along, that's when you kind of get that magic consistent service, isn't it?
Absolutely. Absolutely. You still want the human touch. You still want to talk to somebody. There were lots of situations when I would get a call at 3:00 in the morning because somebody is stuck at the border crying. And at that point, they don't want AI. They don't want a bot. They want to call me and they want me to wake up in the middle of the night. And they want me to talk to the border agent and make sure that they are going to be okay. And that matters. And we should have that. But even in that, there's a way to automate this. So for example, not to be the advertiser of technology here, but PagerDuty does a really good job where you can have a tree, right, for your team, and whoever is on call will get a text and it'll keep calling you until you answer. And so when we implemented something like that at one of our startups that I was part of, our response time went from like hours to 2 minutes. And that makes a huge difference for how the person who is in trouble in that moment will feel and how supported they will feel. Let's see, what else do we have? What other questions do we have? Let's talk about a little bit about global hiring, right? Roland, do you think that we as Deel, are we finding that companies, our clients, prioritizing local talent acquisition, or are they looking more to relocate and to bring expats and hire for international positions from outside of local jurisdictions?
To quote one of your previous answers, it depends. But I guess what those elements depend on is key, isn't it? So there's no doubt that with the shift in the world of work being more remote friendly now, it's reduced the need for an individual to physically have to relocate to another location to deliver those services. Now, there's always times where that will 100% be needed, but it's just not needed quite as much as it was before, is one factor to consider. Another thing is the world is getting more connected through social media, through technology in general. And especially, I remember when I used to work in Dubai and I was a recruiter at the time, the way we found people was, still putting out paper adverts and trying to find people. The world's so connected now, it's much easier for someone to sit in London to be able to find someone who works in Singapore with a specific skill set and find them locally. And then you've also got the point that quite a few years ago, a lot of mobility was into emerging markets where larger businesses had to parachute someone into a new market. And a lot of those markets are more established now. And there is more of availability of skills, more availability of talent in those areas. So perhaps it is easier to find those people locally, especially when you're considering the costs of that full international relocation as well. So there's a lot of things that I think are creating a trend to more international hiring to deliver work and less relocations, but it all just depends on the role itself. And some roles, you're going to need someone with a specific set of knowledge in a specific place that you just can't find locally, and you're always going to have to pick them up and put them there. But more and more often, it's easier to find international talent who can either be local or who can deliver that work anywhere in the world, and they don't need to be local anyway, so there's no need for the relocation.
It's such an interesting topic in general. I'm working on our global mobility annual report, which is really exciting, and we're going to put it out very soon. There's some amazing insights in kind of how people move, why they move, where are they moving, and the majority of our EORs, for example, I think more than 70% are local. They're local nationals, and I think so that supports really what you are saying, that there's still a big percentage of folks that move, but it's interesting to see the motivation for moving, because what we're seeing being added are the digital nomads, and that's a new category entirely. And so this isn't a business need move. This isn't your standard international assignment. This is a fully remote person who is choosing for various reasons, whether it's quality of life, or they just really enjoy Portugal and surfing. Maybe I'm a little biased because I am in Portugal right now, but they are choosing to utilize these new schemes and work remotely from a different country. And I think that's a really cool trend. But obviously comes with complications as well. So you have to be thoughtful and careful when you allow that kind of arrangement.
Yeah, and I see a lot of the same thing, as well as these moves being talent-led rather than job-led in terms of the role as well. When it's quite easy to say, like, anything can be done remotely, you can do it anywhere in the world, but especially for a mobility team when these requests come internally, what things do you think need to be considered to be thought about? Like, are there any tax risks of this? Are there any immigration regulations we need to be thinking about? What are the kind of red flags that we need to be aware of?
Oh man, I think I ask way too many questions, and everybody's always upset with how much information I want. I want to know what all the citizenships that this person has. I want to understand their pattern of travel. I want to understand what the role is, what the salary is, what the educational background is. Are they bringing dependents? I think that's just like a standard approach of any mobility professional. They don't just jump to a conclusion. We are all detectives, and we try to understand, one, the background of this individual, two, the legal standing of this individual currently, what their needs are, what the needs of the business are, and then you apply all of that to local jurisdictions, right? And so there's some really interesting places that are, for example, tightening their regulations. If you look at Spain, for example, Spain started really requiring the degree to be the same as your role. How many of us actually work in the same space that we graduated with our diploma from, right? Most people aren't in the same space at all, but it doesn't mean that they're not highly skilled and really needed for this role. But I think Spain is struggling. They're struggling with quite a high unemployment rate, and so they want to protect their local population. So you'll see these really unique challenges. And so, as always with global mobility, you're going to say, it depends.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's also a big first consideration to take into account about the difference between people having the right to work in a country already and delivering remote international work versus the need for a company to go and expand into a region and strategically put people who are going to be delivering local services as well. I think that's also one of the big things to think about, because there are some differences there.
I agree, absolutely. And I think we did have some questions around PE risk, permanent establishment risk, and how to kind of balance it out. And it really depends, right? It depends on exactly sort of those considerations. Is this business related? What kind of activities are you going to do? Are you going to have warehouses, for example? That's something physical. Is the role global versus is the role providing services in that country? So when we initially engage with our clients, we always do a permanent establishment risk assessment to make sure that the advice that we give in terms of what structure you should try or you could try actually fits what you're trying to accomplish and what the constraints are around it. Let's see what else we have. What are some, did you see the question around contractors in EMEA? There's an interesting question. What are some of the risks of hiring contractors in EMEA and not having an entity in that EMEA country? Do you want to take that one?
Yeah, sure. So whether you've got an entity or not does affect the risk, but perhaps not as much as you would think in some ways. So one of the things one of the first risks to take into account is what Marsha was talking about permanent establishment. So what are these contractors actually going to be doing in this country? Are they remote workers who are getting involved in local commercial revenue generating activities, or is this a digital nomad like me deciding to live in Spain and deliver work that's focused in another country? So that's going to affect the main risk that you want to consider about, is there a PE risk here? Now, the PE risk is often lower with contractors, but it's very important that Deel, we're not an accountant, advisory consultancy trying to tell you what to do with your PE risk. That's fundamentally a question for your own tax team. But these are some of the kind of first things that you'd want to consider. Then it's talking about what are going to be the next risks that you want to consider. So that's then generally going to be around what are going to be the local onboarding requirements that you need to take into account in that country. So if it's the UK, are they going to have their own limited company or an umbrella company, or are they going to need to be VAT certified? So what's going to be those onboarding documents that you're going to want to collect along that process? Then you're going to want to make sure that you've got the right contract in place that reflects any of the local legislation. For instance, Spain, there's some legislation around having over 75 or 80% of your work through one company. Then we need to add in some other references into the contract, and then thinking about if there's, how are we going to effectively pay that person in that country? So they're all the things that are important to consider when you're hiring someone. And that's not necessarily purely reflected on whether you've got an entity there or not. You can quite easily hire people in other countries when you haven't got an entity. Whether you decide to have an entity there or not is generally going to be considered about the business activities that you're doing in that country, and whether you think you're going to be needing to address a permanent establishment risk.
And I think in terms of contractors, I know people get really nervous with contractors. There are definitely rules around contractors. They differ by country. And so it's very, very hard to just say EMEA. EMEA is a really large place. So I would say reach out to us. We can talk through sort of what are some of the actual jurisdictions you are interested in. I would always suggest that you seek legal advice, but we certainly can share our expertise as well.
Definitely. And these things are always easy when you know the answer, right? And it's actually quite simple, the hiring process in one particular country. But what's really difficult is knowing all of that knowledge in so many different countries. And then what's even more difficult is once you've got to a situation where you think you know everything, then something changes and there's something that you need to change the next quarter. So it's really hard for individual businesses to be expected to be experts in all of these countries all the time and keep up with those changes. So it's about how can you work with partners and have automated processes in place where you don't have to make those decisions yourself. And you know that you can work with a partner where you can go, right, we're making a hire in this country, use your technical infrastructure to make it happen without you having to invest too much time into it.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So what have we got next? Moving on to next kind of broad topic with the ground global mobility and hiring. So one we've got here. So what external hires are offered relocation assistance? And how is the return on investment estimated?
I mean, there's so many ways to do it. When I used to work at one of the digital banks in Latin America, when it was still a startup, we used to do calculations all the time. We had clauses in our contracts that if you leave within the first year, we recoup 50%. If you leave within the second year, we recoup 45%. And so it really depends, right? And then it depends on seniority of the role. There are some roles that, for example, we chose strategically not to open to international hiring. And there are some roles that were so difficult to find in those jurisdictions. And this is to roll into your point earlier. Sometimes it's just hard to find that person. And so for them, even if the relocation is going to be quite an expense, it's worth it because you are spending so much time trying to find local talent and just not finding it.
Another point that's quite interesting is with so many more of these requests being talent driven, by retaining an individual who wants to move back to another country, perhaps it's their home country or perhaps they want to relocate somewhere else. A lot of the time when it's driven by the talent, the burden is then obviously shifted on who should pick up the costs of that. You know, when I wanted to move to Spain, Deel weren't going to pay for me to move to Spain because that's my decision. It's something that I wanted to do for my family. So it's not fair to put the costs on me for that. So that's another big consideration.
Although some companies still do a little bit. So they'll pick and choose, right? And so again, this is why it depends. Some startups will say, okay, well, we'll make sure that we'll cover your immigration, but you'll do everything else. And the reason why is because the immigration piece is actually the piece they're really concerned about. They're really worried about your right to work in that country. Because it's amazing how many people think that they can just go on a visitor visa and do work. And then later on you find out and probably get a little gray, but nonetheless, it happens. So I think there's lots of different hybrid approaches to this, depending on sort of your risk tolerance as a business, and your exposure. Lots of smaller private companies just have a very high risk tolerance, honestly.
And the other thing with some of these big companies, I've spoken to mobility professionals before who said, like, we really want an all-encompassing policy about, our flexible working program. These are our rules, and this is how it operates. And they keep going round and round in circle because it's really hard. And back to your answer, it depends, because it can be quite, if you are supporting and using an EOR, for instance, to enable someone to go and work in a different country, there is a cost associated with that. Now, if that's a really key member of the business who you can't live without, the cost of losing that individual versus the cost of the EOR is rather insignificant. But if you've got some perhaps lower wage workers within the business where the cost of the EOR is more disproportionate to the value that they're bringing on the business, you can't suddenly say, like, right, everybody's allowed to go and do this and whenever they like. So a lot of the time it's being able to review these cases on a case by case basis and assess, whether it makes sense for the business and keeping that flexibility for yourself.
Yeah, or have some guidelines. Like I've seen some really sensible things like, oh, you should have 2 performance, like PMCs, performance management cycles, right? That you are at least a certain level, like you're performing well, we have confidence in your performance, or you should be this level of seniority and up, or you should be at the company for at least, I don't know, a year or a year and a half.
Yeah.
So there's some mutual sort of investment going on and some mutual understanding that this person is a valuable member of the team. So if we are investing in enabling this, then it makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's really clever. Having the guide rails in place, but with the flexibility to make the ultimate decision yourself without committing beforehand. Yeah. What do we got? When do others review possible visa implications within the hiring process? This is when a mobility brought into the conversation when a new hire is being reviewed, I assume. Is that what you thought from it, Marcia?
I mean, yes. And I think everybody who's ever had to deal with this will say too late, always. But preferably, you want to be brought in early on as sort of your talent acquisition is starting to engage with this candidate. Very often they will disclose, obviously in some jurisdictions, you can't ask certain questions around their eligibility to work until a later stage. But in some other jurisdiction, you can at least ask, are you going to need to be sponsored? And you can do that quite early. And very often they will disclose what they have. And you can do an eligibility check really early on. The other thing, depending on whether or not you're engaging, for example, the way that we do it when we engage with clients, this is before we even sign a contract with a client. I will very often have a more strategic conversations around their mobility needs. I will ask them what countries they're looking at and what kind of sort of roles they're looking to bring. And so I will often design a custom strategy for them because there are situations where you're doing, for example, a merger and acquisition, and you're acquiring things under a certain structure, and then you would have to do a stopgap with an EOR while you're acquiring or setting up your own entity and getting a license to sponsor these foreign nationals. Or sometimes if it's a different type of acquisition, you can actually automatically transfer them with their current permits. So it's so nuanced and so customized that the earlier you get into these conversations from a strategic standpoint, the better.
And I think that's where access to knowledge can also be really helpful as well, similar to the policies that you were talking about, where you can have some guardrails in place but the final yes or no needs to be a human decision, but people having the knowledge and understanding of what's likely to work and what's not. I know coming back to the AI topic again, that's what's really helpful with our AI. Yeah, in Deel, it just means you can literally ask any question and get that high level overview of what's likely to be possible. So you've got enough information to move on right down to the final situation before you make a yes or no.
And you can even go as specific as a candidate. You can go and do an assessment and very quickly say, this person is from here, this is what they have, this is where they're going. And our tool will tell you exactly what you may need. You can then talk to an actual specialist who knows the law. So to your point, yes, you need that human touch, but AI can do a lot.
I think on a high level, that's what people fear so much about AI, that it's either AI or human, but it's not. It's when the two work together that's the sweet spot of
Human
really
enabled AI.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
Exactly.
I don't know if anybody has experienced the Apple Vision Pros. I have, and talk about technology and what technology can do for mobility. The whole time I did a meditation in front of Mount Hood while I'm in Portugal, and it felt really, really real. And the whole time I was thinking, I wonder if I can do country tours this way. I wonder if I could do cultural training this way. I wonder if we could do school tours and searches this way. Like, my brain kept going back to what can we enable with this technology going forward, but where it feels so real, you can actually, your brain fills in the rest. There's an environment where you are in Yosemite, and I swear it was in the winter, and at some point I started feeling cold. And I was thinking, I'm pretty sure I'm not in Yosemite. But so yes, I think AI can do a lot. I think if you pair it with human touch, it can do even more, right?
Absolutely. What have we got next here? So one thing, I was actually talking to a client just this morning about this very topic as well, which was part of a big project, M&A project, where they needed to be able to release contracts with a certain start date, but they are visa dependent. And how do you manage those risks? How do you, when you're in that situation where people need definitive start dates, there's certain variables that different governments you're using and different waiting times, what's the best way to kind of mitigate those risks, do you think?
I think I'm going to bring AI into this again. But first, where we are now, we actually are in very close contact with governments. And so we watch where the delays are. And when we see the delays, we tend to reset expectations as soon as we see it. Even if it won't affect you, I would rather you know that this may impact you and this is what we're seeing as a trend. But I think long term, one of the things that we're building into our tools is actually a more precise sort of predictory model of timelines. And that is thanks to AI and thanks to the data that we're getting. But it's hard. It's always hard, because when mobility professionals say things like, it will take 1 to 3 months to get a visa, they know what they mean by that. And most likely it'll be 3 months. But the person you're talking to will hear, it'll take a month. But that's a month if you say have an attested diploma, which you probably don't have. And so having a more clear conversation and expectation setting around what will it take to get to the 1 month is very important. But then there's some things that you just can't predict, right? There was a point, I think last year, where Germany, of all places, was so delayed on all of their processing. And Germany usually has it together. They're pretty organized. And it was blowing everybody's mind. And it was a very difficult situation. All of a sudden, we were seeing 3, 4, 5 month delays, and we couldn't understand why. Then once they started getting that data, they actually reorganized and changed some of their legislation and alleviated some of the processing time, because they alleviated some of the requirements. But there are other countries that just don't do that. Take Portugal. Again, I'm biased. I love Portugal dearly, but you can wait for 1.5 to 2 years for your residence card. That's just reality if you're doing it in country right now. If you do it outside of the country, depending on where it's much faster. But these are the conversations that our specialists, because they're local, and because they know the landscape, because they know the government, they can have, and they can really work with you on, hey, this is not realistic. So instead, we could do this as a stopgap, right? There's always a workaround. So what can you do in the meantime while you're waiting?
Absolutely. Moving on more to the kind of compensation and benefit side of things. So we've got a good question here about what's typically included in packages for remote new hires. What are some of the trends that you see there, Marcia?
I mean, immigration is usually something that's pretty standard that I see. Relocation is a lot less of a thing these days. Most people just want kind of either a lump sum or they want to do their own thing, surprisingly. But we're talking, often these are not whole families that are moving, or these are folks who are already in country, but they just need support to renew or change employer or something like that. Yeah, I can't say that I'm just not seeing those robust old school packages where you have tax equalization or you have corporate housing. It's just not in demand. For some executives, definitely, but it's no longer the rule. It's more of an outlier. People like the flexibility of just getting just enough and making their own decisions, or having some support with choices. But the pieces that usually get covered for sure, either the hiring model itself, benefits that are statutory, maybe some things that are on top, and then immigration gets covered all the time.
And I also think a lot of, when we're talking about remote hires, rather than people going to another country due to the job requirements, a lot of the people who are looking for the remote job, for them, the big benefit is finding a really cool company that's happy to hire you remotely cross-border. And although the amount of companies that doing that is increasing, it's still a limited pool of employers who can offer that flexibility to hire people remotely anywhere in the world. So I think people are the big benefit is that you do it in the first place.
The flexibility, absolutely. Yeah. The flexibility. You will have your, top 1% of very unique, skilled individuals. And we see it pretty consistently. It tends to be STEM, right? Like it tends to be software engineers or data scientists or products. Those are probably the top professions that I see that you will do almost anything for, because it's so hard to get. But everybody else is just really just excited. Great, you let me work from Portugal. I love you, Deel. and the countries themselves already adapted, right? I don't need a tax equalization policy. There is a tax scheme in country that I can utilize. So I'm not impacted, and nor is the company. And so there are definitely things that aren't just driven by the companies anymore, but also the countries are starting to take advantage of it. Or look at what Canada did last year. I thought that was really brilliant. I mean, they essentially said, okay, we'll do a digital nomad visa as a visitor for business. Just come in, try us out for 6 months. You can work remotely, not a big deal, please. I mean, I thought that was brilliant. Lots of people.
As a result, I think Canada was one of our top most requested visa countries in our last report as well.
Was.
No surprise.
It really was. Yeah.
Exactly. Linking back to that relocation piece, there's another question here about when we're talking about relocation rather than new remote hires. Many companies are starting to shift away from those kind of fully supported relocation packages to lump sum packages, because it's just easier and easier to kind of predict and budget for in the business. Firstly, are you seeing that as a trend? And if so, are there any kind of good places to get that data and understanding of what those costs is and what those lump sums should be?
Sure. Yes, we're seeing that as a trend, but there's a second trend with it. It's either a lump sum or it's almost like a point system where you have a certain number of points and a menu. And so I can go in and I can say, I need this service. I need a shipping service and I need pet relocation, versus somebody who is a parent is going to go in and say, oh, I really need school search or settling in services. And so you have that flexibility. It's still essentially a lump sum, but the way it's presented to you is in this very flexible, what works for your needs. And you can play with those points and allocate them the way that you really want. And maybe you're as crazy as I am, and you want to allocate all of the points to like this cool K9 jets company where you can take your French bulldogs with other dogs on board of a chartered plane because you cannot put them in cargo. It depends. It depends on your priorities. So also just how cool of a business idea is that? There's just lots of different ways, but it's definitely moving away from the traditional, very prescribed packages to more flexibility so that you can choose as the person using it, what do you actually need?
And another thing, with especially linking more to the relocation piece as well, like how much support do you need to give individuals when they land in a new country now in terms of, the accommodation, the bank setup? How far do you go supporting that, and how do you go about getting the support if it's needed?
It really depends which country. So, and where you're coming from. Do you speak the language? How much of a traveler are you? I think, when I moved to the UK, I remember getting an apartment and being like, what is this council tax thing? I don't understand. Or why do I need to have a license for the TV when I don't watch TV? I don't understand that. So there's like such weird nuances everywhere. And so I think, at least from what I'm seeing settling in services and like that initial support of, hey, we'll at least help you kind of navigate how to set up utilities or how to open a bank account. Those tend to be really popular and still offered quite often. And you can get all those, all the data really lives with your relo provider. We are currently partnering with a couple of relo providers, so we kind of pool the data and look at the trends. But yeah, it's quite important to have somebody help you when you first arrive, especially if you don't speak the language. So with English speaking countries, way easier, but try going to I was going to say Russia, not that anybody would want to go to Russia right now, but that's probably going to be much harder if you don't speak the language.
Another one, moving on to the section of compliance that we've got here. So when, and especially for whether you're a small or larger internal mobility team, and you're having to keep track of compliance in multiple different countries, and there's only a limited internal team of you, how do you kind of maintain international compliance in multiple countries concurrently and keep on top of that?
This is where you really need to have a good partner in the game, right? So for us, for example, we have our Deel AI, and we are constantly updating it. We're constantly linking it to the right sort of sources of information that it updates in real time. If your partners are more traditional, larger firms like Fragment or Deloitte's or the PwC's, they put out advisories, they put out newsletters. I highly recommend following and subscribing to those. It's impossible to remember everything. There are some really strange requirements out there. There's one that I recently had to navigate that for a visa in Thailand, there's a very specific requirement of how many local nationals to a foreign national that you have to have. And not only do you have to have a certain ratio, but you have to take a picture of the foreign national for the visa application with your local employees. And that's a really unique thing. And so this is where we actually are starting to engage and talk to different governments about sort of digitizing and changing some of their more sort of old school approaches and evolving with the world. But yeah, I would lean heavily on your vendors for this, because this is our bread and butter, right? Like I scour regulatory changes as like a thing I do. Some people scroll through TikTok. I look for immigration, for example, updates all the time. I'm a nerd.
I'm conscious we've probably got about 20 minutes left. It'd be good to save a bit of time for questions at the end. So moving on to the next section around global mobility leadership. So yeah, especially in these larger organizations, there's often lots of competing interests of big characters in the business, coupled with that lack of understanding of what the impact of hiring across borders can be. Have you got any tips on how to successfully manage kind of these different competing industries and ensuring that there's global compliance?
Or how to educate almost your executive stakeholders is really what needs to happen, right? And the only way to do that is with data. I've had so many conversations where I said, oh, but this person is going to get in trouble and here's what's going to happen. They're going to be really upset. And my executive stakeholder said, how do I know how to quantify this risk? How often does it happen? It's just not enough to tell a story. You have to tell a story with data. If you can tell a story with data, you will be able to really navigate that space very well. And you become that strategic resource ultimately. So my biggest advice is know your data, know who your population is, understand how to pull that data and read that data and get trends and insights from it to tell the story you were trying to tell. What would be your advice?
Similar as well. And I think you've got to look at what the objectives are of the executives and leaderships in the business and what they're trying to achieve, and be able to use that data and insights about how it's going to help them to do what they want. It's lovely to have a flexible working policy where everyone can work remotely. But for a business to adopt that, there really has to be a business reason for them to want to do that, and what's in it for the business and how's it going to help the business move forward. And if you can bring the knowledge and the data to be able to articulate the story about how this particular policy is going to help the business, then it's a win-win. With all the data in the world, if it's not in the best interest of the business and it's not going to help advance the business, it's much harder to get buy-in, really.
And to that point, I think one of the questions was like, now with all this technology and the ability to work remotely, how do you as a global mobility professional, how do you convince your executive stakeholders? How do you make the case that these people should be sent abroad? And like it all kind of comes together in that, right?
Absolutely. And I've seen it go both ways. I've seen sometimes companies invest so much time and so much investment into such a relatively small scale challenge that you do wonder, well, why are you putting so much time into this? And other times where they're just not prepared to invest the right amount based on the payoff it could be. And that there's obviously some missing dots in the story to the executives about how much is going to cost and what's the likely impact of it's going to be as well.
I mean, retention, right? We talk about retention very often, and that one of the reasons to allow international assignments or secondments or even remote work is retention. But what does that mean? You can't just say, oh, I want to retain this employee. Why? Why do you want to retain that particular employee? You really have to give the data and the business case to support that. And I agree. Then you have to ask yourself, how much investment into that business case do you want to put? And sometimes, this is your top performer. Yeah, you're going to spend all the time in the world to try to make the case.
Yeah. And on that piece, what advice would you give for gaining a voice at that top table to develop and implement an international hiring strategy?
I mean, I think first, don't come to that table with answers. I would discourage that entirely. Come to that table to understand what the business needs and what the limitations are and what the risk appetite is, right? Once you know those three things, then you can actually come back with a thoughtful strategy that will address the needs and the trade-offs. There's always trade-offs. And when you do that, I wouldn't just give one strategy. I would give several, and I would highlight what the trade-offs are. If you can guide the decision in a more analytical way with data, it's always more successful. One other thing, and this is maybe my personal pet peeve, but we often want to cram a lot of jargon and a lot of information into this strategy, and we lose our audience. And so when you're talking to executives, think about your elevator pitch. What do I need to know in 10 seconds to make that decision? That's it. That's all you need. But if you give me a book about how you could do 10 different visas and 3 different packages and ask me to read it, and I am the executive, you're going to lose me. It's just not going to happen. And so then I will not value you because you don't understand the audience. So be concise. I would always push everybody to be concise. I think all of my direct reports know that when they send something to me and it's a little too long and a little too legal, I say, less words. Talk to me like I'm your grandmother, because that's the only way we're going to get to a common place.
Excellent. And one other area is quite interesting to touch on at the end is kind of some just general market condition, trends, predictions, etc. And I think, especially in the global talent space, it's a really interesting and just such fast moving pace at the moment. It feels like only the other day, all of the headlines were around about the Great Resignation, and everybody was thinking about jacking in their jobs because they could get 5 offers for a new job the next day. Then in the blink of an eyelid, we've gone from lots of companies suddenly making mass layoffs everywhere and people being scared about their job. We've gone from the extreme of COVID for the whole world being work remote to now what seems all the headlines about the big return to office mandates from all these organizations. So we've literally been swinging from polar opposites in terms of different sides of the scale in quite a short period of time. But I think even with those big swings, there's definitely been some new kind of base level trends that have emerged regardless of what's going on in the moment. And we do a big global talent report, which I can share afterwards as well if you go on the website or get in contact with me. And in that, it clearly demonstrated that despite that, global hiring is still very much on the rise as well. And the whole dynamics of global hiring are changing massively. A big interesting thing that I was reading recently in one of our articles is the US was always someone who hired remote workers around the world. And actually now there's so many US workers working remotely from the US for other companies around the world. And I think that's been because, you've had these return to office mandates. People have always been so US focused. And now they're like, well, I could actually go and work anywhere else in the world. The US labor market as an exporter is of a very high standard, and suddenly they're engaging around the world. I think one thing that we've already touched on a big trend is this idea of employee-led rather than work-led mobility being hugely on the rise. Definitely, this is no new trend, but freelancing and contracting has been growing and growing as people look to redesign their relationship with work and what they want out of work. I think last year the freelancing market in the US alone was 1.2 trillion in the US and growing all the time. And we're going from a world where freelancing used to be perceived as someone caught in between jobs who was taking this because they couldn't get a good permanent job, to actually being a destination career choice, especially with digital nomads who are wanting to design, how to deliver work around their schedule. And I think that's a big trend. Any other trends that you're seeing at all?
I'm definitely seeing all of those, but I am on the other side too, looking at legislation and how legislation is changing. And it's interesting to see lots of different countries really thinking and being thoughtful about what kind of talent they want to attract, and very specific to what kind of talent they want to attract, really focusing on putting out entrepreneur visas, for example, or promoting digital nomad visas and tax schemes that would support that kind of engagement. They want highly skilled professionals to come in and engage in the economy. At the same time, they want entrepreneurs to come in and engage in the economy and bring more jobs. And even if you look at, for every foreign national that we hire, how many local jobs they end up creating, it's really interesting. So there's lots of mixing going on, but you have some countries that are really struggling with that influx. I keep talking about Portugal, but they really, really are struggling. 180,000 people are in their backlog. They've changed their immigration department entirely in October or November. And the new one just came out and said, yes, we will get through the backlog in the next year or two. That's crazy. And so it's interesting that, yes, the international hiring is on the rise, but it also is having such huge impact on timelines, on requirements, and how different countries are approaching reshaping their legislation.
Great. And we got a few minutes. Should we try and fly through a few quick round questions in the chat?
Let's do it.
Marsha, I love this one. With global mobility professionals seeing all of these people working remote, what's the scope for global mobility professionals to be able to work remotely? You could probably be a testament to that in your situation and your team, isn't it, Marsha? I think it's a very remote friendly role.
Yes, I mean, we're 48 or 50 people, speaking 26 languages in 20 plus countries. I think we can do our job anywhere, right? The more important piece is, what are your language skills? Because very often we engage with local authority, and local authority will speak local languages. So I think for us, it's more around language skills and understanding of the local laws, rather than, are you physically in that location? So there's lots of flexibility there, at least for us.
Another one, are there any specific performance metrics or indicators used to gain the success of ongoing international placements? So once it's done, how do you then measure the effectiveness of it?
That's a really good question. And I think that there's lots of sort of metrics around it for more formal assignments, but it's interesting. It would be interesting to look at the remote piece. I don't actually think there's a lot of data around this. I think part of the problem with remote is people tend to just hop, right? They tend to hop. And so is that a success? Is the success that they just don't come back? Or do they just stay with that same employer, but they're allowed to hop? So is the retention piece the success? We're starting to look at that data, but it's a little bit early on. So I think maybe by the next webinar, we will have some trends to report on.
Perfect. A quick one, is EOR an option in Portugal and in Spain? The answer to that is yes, in both situations. As we said before, each country have their own nuances of how these assignments need to be set up to make sure they're compliant, but we can offer in both those countries. Are language training programs or resources available to support international hires in adapting to a new language or culture?
Absolutely. And it actually comes up with with the point system. You could some companies offer it as part of their point system. Some companies offer it in general, like Nubank. I was with Nubank, and I was learning Portuguese, and that was really, really cool. That was one of the perks. But you don't even need the company to do that, right? Like there's so many resources online. The other day, I just went and downloaded a bunch of YouTube videos to continue learning Portuguese. And on a flight, on like an 11-hour flight, ended up just going through all of them and practicing the whole time. So I think that's part of the beauty of sort of technology and evolution of technology and where we are with information. It's so available. You don't need a prescribed program to access that information. Do you remember when we had to go to libraries? Maybe it's showing my age, but I remember. And so I don't need to. I just go on my phone.
My sum up comments would be, as you fully well know, as much as anyone, the global mobility world can be complex, and trying to know the answer to everything all the time is very hard. So, choose wisely the partners you work who can support you and make you as good at your role as possible, and try to embrace the changes in the mobility role, embracing things like technology and AI, because it will be the future of how this market evolves, and stay ahead of the curve in terms of the changes.
And I think to that point, not only do you choose wisely your partners, but choose partners who are interested in finding out who you are as a company, as a culture, and understanding your risk appetite and being flexible enough to explore very custom options for you. Because I think one of the things that we always run into is that we get an answer from our providers that's very black and white. Mobility is not black and white. We live in the gray, right? And it really depends on where you are as a business. So really seek somebody who wants to partner with you rather than just tell you an answer.